Thank you. Um, so hi, congratulations, almost on the
Thank
book.
you. Thank you.
Um, I have so much I'd like to ask you. So maybe I'll just start. Like, given that you're busy anyway and you're serving in so many different ways, and it's so much work to write a book, what inspired you to write this book?
Mm. I started writing it in 2020, actually, when we had that incredibly challenging series of events unfold, starting with the pandemic, and then here in the US, George Floyd's murder. And then within a few months after that, I don't know if you recall, Sharon, we had this season of really horrific wildfires out here in California. I actually had to evacuate from someplace in the Sierras. And one of the ways I, as many of us who teach meditation, felt like I could contribute was to write about how to face challenges and root ourselves in our inner strengths. And so it was out of that time that I started reflecting more and writing more about not just meditation, but this whole range of different capacities and qualities we can develop through contemplative practice. And there's a part of my heart that feels sad. It's kind of an understatement that the book is even more relevant today than when I started writing it. But I think a lot of us have a sense that there's something deeply wrong in our world today, whether it's the ecological crisis, the political situation, um, the wars unfolding around the world, inflation. There's so much uncertainty about the future, as well as just tremendous grief and pain in the present. And so, given the intensity of the struggles that so many of us are going through, it seems like a time where we really need resources, inner resources, to handle the challenges. And, one of the things that I feel like I've learned from you, from our work together, and your teaching, is really understanding not just meditation, but the whole path as a kind of skill building practice. And so I see the book and its offering of contemplative practice as a kind of medicine for the challenges that we're facing, how fragmented so many people feel, how overwhelmed our nervous systems are, how broken our hearts feel many times. And so that's kind of what the book grew out of.
That's beautiful. Um, when I wrote this book called Faith many moons ago, and somebody I had consulted as a writing coach, and one of the many times I was stuck, said, amongst other great things she said to me, this was Susan Griffin, she said, people might think you write a book like that because you're a complete expert on it and you want to impart your expertise, but more
Mhm.
likely you write a book on a topic like that because you're exploring the topic and the writing is part of the exploration. So I'm just curious what your experience was in terms of it deepening your understanding in the very writing of it.
Yeah, exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's exactly what the experience was for me. And I can say, like, in two ways. I think there are two really important things that I learned, or am still learning, through the writing process in the book. Um, so one is, as you know, my first book focuses a lot on communication, and for me, that was kind of this progression from what we learn on the cushion in our meditation practice into relationships. And being a parent, having a young child now, I've really been grappling with the question of how does our practice relate to the larger issues of our world, and specifically to social change, and wanting to bridge that gap, not just from the personal to the interpersonal, but to the social. So one of the core themes that I explore in the book is not just how do we develop inner resources, but how do those express themselves? And how does our inner cultivation, or can and how can our inner cultivation play a role in working for change in the world? So this is one key thing that I was grappling with as I was writing the book, and really asking myself and looking at from many different angles with all of the different qualities I explore in the book. The other thing that the book really pushed me to look deeply into was just clarifying my own understanding and experience of each of these aspects of the path. And, what does courage really mean to me, and how have I experienced it, and what is its utility in our lives and in our world? Or what is the value of renunciation, particularly when it comes to issues like the ecological crisis, where individual actions aren't going to tip the scales? And does renunciation have value not just on a spiritual and moral level? What's its relationship to working for change? So, needing to look more carefully at the qualities and understand them in myself, and differentiate them from a lot of the kind of pop ideas or um, sort of pat notions we can have about something like kindness or compassion, and getting really clear and specific about them. Yeah.
It's great. Well, the topic for today's session is spiritual resources for resilience, which is certainly something we are probably all thinking about. And you've mentioned the challenges, some of the challenges that we're living through today: the ecological crisis, war, inflation. And I'm wondering if you could say more about the title of your book, which I find very intriguing. Your heart was made for this.
Mm,
Um, it sort of it reminds me of something somebody told me, sort of in kind of terrible beginnings of the time of the pandemic, and everything disrupted and changed, and so many people I knew, dying in New York, and terrible things. And somebody said that his statement of encouragement to himself was, "You were made for this. You were born for this." So then
mm,
he offered that to me, as a
mhm.
way of bringing up courage and strength. And I mean, there's something genuine about it, not just, if you say this, you'll feel better. Yeah. So what did you mean, and what was your whole process of? Do you
Yeah,
really think we are made for this? That we are able to navigate these kind of times?
yeah. I think it's a legitimate question, and what I like about the question and the title is that it is kind of provocative in that sense of really, you
Yeah.
know. And for me, there's a way in which yes, there's a yes there, and there's a no. Um, I think on one level, in a very real sense, our heart, in the sense of our biology and our nervous systems, were not designed for the world we live in today. And a lot of evolutionary biologists talk about this. It's something that's recognized phenomenon that, we evolved in small communities, with no more than 50 to 150 connections, and expect to have certain things in our lives like enough downtime and uh, nourishment from social connection, a shared sense of meaning and purpose and place in the world. So many of the things that modernity has stripped us of. We live in a much more fast-paced and complicated world than I think our nervous systems are really built to contend with, let alone the kind of influence of technology and the fragmentation of our attention, um, or the exposure to tragic news from all over the world at any hour of the day. So, on that level, I think our nervous systems are contending with an environment that is inherently at odds with how we're designed. So what does it mean that our hearts were made for this then? I think for me, it means two things. One, it's very consonant with the story that you just told, that, why do we practice? Why do we have spiritual cultivation? It's not just so that we can feel good when everything's going our way. It's precisely to be able to rise to the challenge when things are really hard. And in that sense, on a spiritual level, on a moral level, on an ethical level, I think our hearts were made for this. This is those of us who were born into this time. These are the greatest tasks we will face, to be in right relationship with everything that's unfolding and find our place to contribute in a meaningful way. That's one meaning for me of what does it mean to say our hearts were made for this. The other meaning, which is kind of a play on words with the nervous system interpretation, is that I believe, what the Buddha discovered, that our hearts were made to wake up, that we were made to flourish and to realize our full potential. And one of the things that's been so beautiful about being a parent and being around a newborn is to see how beautiful the human spirit is when it comes into this world. How loving, how generous, how joyful, how enthusiastic, how curious, how playful. And to recognize that so much of the violence and disconnection that happens in our world is learned through experience. So one of the analogies I like to use is when we're born, we have the capacity to learn any language, right? Our neurology is primed to learn any sounds, any grammar. And in the same way, I feel like our hearts are primed to express all of these beautiful qualities, to, embody compassion, forgiveness, empathy, integrity. And the question is, do we cultivate them? Do we live into our potential? And so it's the kind of invitation and exploration that I engaged with in the book is how do we make that journey?
Was that 150 social connections over the course of a lifetime?
I think it's a specific figure. It's something called Dunbar's number. That's a certain theory about human evolution that says that the sort of size of the band or the tribe, including external connections, is somewhere between 50 and 150, and that something about our neurology is designed to have we kind of max out there evolutionarily. Yeah.
What would you say to someone who got on average about 150 emails an hour?
Right.
Just
Balance,
asking.
rest. Yeah. I mean, so much of the book, in terms of how I try to make, so the book goes through all of these different qualities we can develop that are rooted in the path, but broader than just Buddhist practice. And there are practices in each chapter for reflection, for meditation, for action. And one of the sections in each chapter is if you have difficulties. And I feel like so many of the difficulties we have in our world, in our lives today, in terms of developing spiritually, ethically, morally, finding balance, have to do with the external circumstances of our lives, whether it's just sort of the sheer pace of modernity, or external circumstances due to structural violence or oppression. And so how do we contend with those? How do we compensate for those conditions is one of the things that I try to make real in the book so that the skills can be really practiced.
So the subtitle of the book is interesting as well. It's Contemplative Practices to Meet a World in Crisis with Courage, Integrity, and Love. I'm wondering if that was a conversation with your publisher to include love, or maybe not with that publisher. How do you define contemplative practice? And
Mhm.
can you give us some examples of practices that are actually included in the book.
Sure. Yeah. The conversation with the publishers, whose Shambhala was more the "Your Heart Was Made for This" part of the title. I pushed for the parts of the subtitle, I think, less around the love and more a world in crisis, because it feels important. It felt really important to me to acknowledge a kind of sobering truth of our times, and it's not just a feel-good thing. I think it's appropriate to be uncomfortable and uneasy today, given everything we're living through. And yeah, those three in particular, I honed in on them, I think, because they feel essential in some way in that order. It's like we need courage to actually turn towards the truth. We need integrity to feel a sense of inner strength to face the truth. And then love is the piece that softens it, right? That nourishes us with connection and that takes us beyond ourselves. So I define contemplative practice in the book as anything that cultivates awareness, reflection, and that connects us with a sense of meaning, purpose, or perspective. And one of my aims with the book, in the last somewhere between 10 to 20 years, if depending on how you cut it, mindfulness has become so well known, and meditation along with it. I mean, you've been doing it longer than I've been alive. But even in my lifetime, like when I started in the late 90s, meditation was not in the public conversation in the way it is today. So I think it's a great benefit to our world that mindfulness and meditation are common terms now. And yet it feels like there's a real limitation there in not recognizing the breadth of the path and the kind of variety and creativity that's available. So one of the analogies I've been using as I talk about it is, it's like thinking about the difference between running and exercise. I don't like to run. So if I said, well, I don't like to run, so I'm not going to exercise, that wouldn't make any sense, because there's so many ways to exercise. In the same way, I feel like not everyone connects with meditation. But there's so many other ways to cultivate awareness and reflection and to connect with meaning and to move beyond ourselves. So that's what I'm really exploring with the book. And art can be contemplative practice, ritual, movement, storytelling, relationships. So reflection is one of the practices that I rely a lot on in the book. And we did kind of a little reflection in the guided meditation at the beginning of the session. It's a sense of taking a theme and allowing oneself to explore it in a receptive way. So it's using thought, image, memory to shape the mind and to shape our inner life. One of the reflections at the very beginning of the book, to come back to your book on faith, is a reflection on aspiration and faith, and so kind of listening deeply for what's most important to us. What do we know or trust in our hearts, and how do we want to orient in our life? Another contemplative practice that I use in the book and for different qualities is working with image. The image can be a very powerful way to access different parts of our consciousness. So, for example, in the chapter on patience, one of the tools I offer for cultivating patience is recollecting an image that represents patience. Like here in California, we have the old growth redwoods, these massive, massive trees, or a mountain, image of a great mountain, or in the commentaries, they use the image of a lake, right? The shore of a great lake, encompassing the energy of anger or hatred. So recollecting an image and reflecting on it as a way of developing a connection with a quality would be another example of a form of contemplative practice. And all of them rest upon the skill of training our attention and this kind of underlying insight of the Buddha, and I think all forms of contemplative practice, that how we use our attention every day shapes our inner life, and that we're always practicing something. So developing the skills of attention so that we can choose more consciously and steer inwardly around what are we building? What kind of world are we building, not just externally, but internally? And that's really where I see the potential for cultivating spiritual resources for resilience, is that every day, if we develop the capacity to know where our attention is going and to redirect it skillfully, not to avoid the things that are difficult or painful, but to make conscious choices about when we're engaging with them and when we're nourishing ourselves, we can develop a more rich, robust, and stable inner life so that we have more to offer.
All right. It's beautiful.
Mm.
And I used to say that my favorite word, as it was for many years, was poignancy. And in talking
Mm.
about the heart of compassion, that flavor of poignancy there, and these days they say my favorite word is emergent
Mm.
or emerging, because uh, meditation is attention training. It's one of the many, many ways, as you point out, we can do attention training. And when people think about training in loving kindness or training in compassion or something like that, it sounds so odd and it feels so cold. But really, it's all saying that we know we can train attention, and all of these other things are like emergent properties of paying attention differently.
Mm.
So you don't set out and say, I'm going to be more loving today in some forceful, coerced, weird way. But just from experience, that if you look directly at people instead of through them, or you listen to somebody instead of hold in your mind some rigid impression of them, that what you're laying the conditions for what may then emerge, which is some sense of connection. And so you have an interesting list of emergent qualities. You have 26 chapters in this book, each on a different quality. And many of them, of course, I recognize from uh, Buddhist teaching, like mindfulness, energy, concentration, kindness, compassion, and so on. But some are, they're not disconnected, I think, from anything we might experience in training attention to be different, but they're not in sort of the classical list, like rest or play. And how did you choose the qualities?
Mm. So I first I want to comment on that beautiful teaching you just offered on emergent, and what it made me think of was an interview I heard with Rebecca Solnit recently. Actually, I think it was the interview that James and you did on
Mm-hmm,
Tricycle,
mm-hmm,
where she was talking about the root of the word emergency being connected to emergent, and that possibility that opens up when there is an emergency. So just connecting that sense of the emergence of the beauty of the heart through how we pay attention with the emergence of our capacities to contribute and to make different choices as we face different crises. So in structuring the book, so I looked at all of the kind of core Buddhist lists, and for those who are kind of Buddhist geeks on the call here, that Sati Center is running, the Bodhipakya, I think it's called, that the core lists that, there are 37 different qualities if you add them all up, and some of them are repeated. So I looked at the 5 powers, the 7 factors of awakening, the 10 paramis, the 4 brahmaviharas, the 5 jhana factors. And one of the things that emerged, both in looking at the lists, but also just through my own practice over the years, is an understanding of a certain kind of underlying template of energy in the list, that there seems to be this kind of wave-like pattern if you look at many of the lists of these kind of foundational qualities that create a certain stability and initiate energy. And then it reaches some kind of a peak. And then there's this integration moving towards freedom or release. And so I looked at that pattern and pulled out the qualities that seem to be the most relevant for the world we're living in and the crises we're facing, and thought, how can I structure these in a way that take people through that cycle multiple times in the book? So I chose 26 somewhat randomly, because if you do 2 weeks for every chapter, you have a whole year. So it becomes like a year-long training for the heart. And so in addition to the classical qualities you mentioned and that come out of the Buddhist lists, I was also just thinking about, as you said, like, what are the other things that we do develop in meditation, or that are necessary, whether they're named explicitly or not in the teachings. And, rest is there, of course, in things like tranquility or calm, but it's not language that way. And then I thought about, some of the medicines we need in our lives today, like rest, like play, and the roles that those play in working for social change, and the need to nourish our hearts. So another theme that I explore a lot in the book with the different qualities is this theme of balance, which is woven throughout the Buddha's teachings. But how do we balance energy with rest? How do we balance resolve with patience? And so there's a kind of back and forth movement throughout the book, both, again, in terms of our individual practice and cultivation, but then also in how that moves out into the world, and the choices we make, whether it's through service, social activism, or other ways of contributing, and the need to really bring lightness and joy and humor and play into our work so that we don't burn out, so that we are nourished.
Do you think that you ordered them in a particular way, or is it just what happened?
Some of it is very specifically chosen, particularly the first part where I start with attention and then go through the 5 spiritual faculties. I feel like it lays out a really strong foundation. The order of the qualities within each part is very specific in terms of that pattern, that wave-like pattern. But I moved chapters around in up until, like, the final draft. And even now looking at the book, I'm like, oh, it would have been interesting to put this one here versus that one. So in some sense, after the first part, my hope is that people won't feel bound to the order, and actually will feel free to, like, think, okay, well, what is it that I need right now? And jump ahead to the chapter on rest, for example, or if there's a particularly challenging ethical situation unfolding at work or in one's life, it's like, let's go look at the chapter on integrity and think more deeply about what that means to me. And so that it can really be a companion and a resource to meet people where they're at. Yeah.
I want to read a passage from your book. You write, popular mindfulness suggests that the sole source of our suffering is individual and internal, ignoring the vast influence of structural factors such as racism, sexism, and poverty on our well-being and our ability to access our inner resources. So my first question to you is, you phrased it as popular mindfulness as compared to kind of the classical meanings of mindfulness in the text. So do you think the classical meaning is broader than that, or does it seem to rely heavily on that? And then I'm curious about what role you see for mindfulness specifically in contemplative practice more broadly in addressing these kind of structural issues.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think it's clear that, like, the Buddha wasn't trying to restructure ancient Indian society. That wasn't his mission. And so I think he was pinpointing, the internal suffering, the internal experience of suffering on an individual level. But I don't think he's necessarily limiting mindfulness to just that internal investigation. Of course, he talks about applying mindfulness internally and externally, both internally and externally. So I think there is a broader sense in the classical teachings of how we use mindfulness that then gets reduced even further in popular secular mindfulness. But as far as the causes of suffering, it's a deep question, I think, in how the Buddha defines dukkha, and it does seem to me that he is really looking at the individual emotional, psychological, spiritual experience of struggle and being burdened, however we want to define dukkha, and that the external circumstances maybe get defined more in the context of pain as unpleasant experience, right? Whether it's physical pain, or the pain of war, the pain of poverty, and so forth. And yet, I think what's so remarkable about the practice and the teaching is that I think it does provide an invaluable tool for working for change on a structural level. So some of the things I talk about in the book, one is that, and this is, I think, one of the more commonly understood applications of our practice when it comes to oppression and structural factors, is it provides a lens to investigate more deeply our conditioning, right? So I talk in the book about how practice has been a support for me in understanding and becoming aware of, patriarchal conditioning that I've internalized or acted out, internalized anti-Semitism in myself, or unconscious racism, things like this. So that's not only the mindfulness practice, but all of the other qualities we develop in training our attention, like courage and curiosity, kindness towards ourselves, the capacity to let go, I think supports us to look more honestly at these things and begin to transform them.
Mm-hmm.
I really love the phrase that you're fond of, that you share so often on social media, of meditation doesn't replace action. So of course we need more than that inward looking to actually address and engage in structural violence and oppression, or the climate crisis, all of these issues we're facing. And yet, I think that our contemplative practice has a key role to play in that process. I feel like a lot of the times, spiritual practice, or even the kind of wellness sector and social change, get presented as an either or, that it's sort of mutually exclusive thing, but I really see them as supporting each other. Our practice helps us to not only understand the dynamics of oppression and transform them, but to come from a different place in how we're working for change and align our means with the end that we want to see, so that we're not unintentionally sort of recreating patterns of domination or shaming or excluding in our work for change. And then the service and social work and activism offer a vehicle to express our values or our love, and another way of creating leverage to work for change on a structural level, broader than just our individual actions.
Well, I think in many ways the Buddha did foster social change. Just first of all, when we change our vision of life and when
Hmm.
we develop insight, like into interconnection, which
Hmm.
is really a function of seeing more clearly, and so we're back to paying attention differently. um Many things move from that, so one's view,
Mm.
one's worldview is really important. But the Buddha specifically, when I think about, uh ironically, in the evolution of time, like when the Buddha first, seemed to me, proposed intention behind an action as the seed of the moral valence, he was challenging the entire caste system,
Mm.
which in the philosophies of that time would often say, what was right and appropriate or dharmic or moral for a Brahmin male was completely forbidden to a soldier caste, whatever that was called,
Hmm.
um, to study scripture, to mediate with the divine. It was also forbidden to a Brahmin female. And so morality was held by one's birth, in effect. And the Buddha was saying, well, that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what your gender or your caste or your social status or your skin color. An act born of hatred will have certain kinds of consequences. An act born of love, as its intention, will have
Mm.
certain kind of consequences. And there was a
Hmm.
huge upheaval and very threatening in many ways. And there were other things like that. But I think of that because, it is such a part of the classical teaching, and it's still very important. And these days, in innumerable diversity and inclusion workshops, one hears, intention is not the point, because look at impact.
Hmm.
And I think that makes a lot of sense too. It fits even in the teachings, because it's not just the intention, there's the skillfulness of the execution. You can have an intention that's also full of delusion, about skill and speech or so on, back to communication.
Yeah.
um but it's just interesting, that things kind of shift in the course of time, and just having clarity from the Buddhist point of view, clarity about certain things causes a revolution
Mm.
all in and of itself.
Yeah. I love that you're bringing all of that in and kind of making the distinction, I think, between, like, one, the transformative power of the practice and the teachings on a social level, um, and two, how some of the Buddha's teachings, including, I mean, things that you didn't mention that we could go into in terms of how he structured the monastic sangha, which is kind of democratic and egalitarian, um, did challenge the social structures, and the distinction between that, and kind of the explicit aim of the teachings in terms of individual liberation, right? So there are those two levels.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So I want to congratulate you on including the word crisis in your subtitle. I know it's often not easy, and that every publisher, gets anxious about, people will be turned off and they'll find it depressing, or they'll fear it will be depressing, so they won't get the book. So it's not always easy to do that, but you did that, which is really good. And one thing I do notice about the book, and I think this is something we spoke about in the process of your writing it, is that there are no chapters on difficult emotions like anger, grief, sorrow, or burnout. So why not? Speaking as a Buddhist.
Yeah. I'm pausing because I'm like, should I make a joke about, because I wanted to avoid those and I don't like experiencing them.
That's a good joke though, because
Yeah,
you can
because
hear
it's
the
true. We don't
collective
like
sigh, like,
feeling
yeah,
those
me too.
things.
Yeah, they're hard.
Yeah, they are. They are. And yet, as you say, they're so essential for not just the times we're facing, but for just being human, and,
Yeah.
living a full life includes all of that. Um, yeah, I
Well,
remember
the fuller question is, what do you see the place, or can you describe the place of these
yeah,
painful experiences in developing resilience?
yeah. Well, I mean, the place of them, it's, it's so often those really challenging times that call forth our deepest strengths, right? It's, when we're grieving the most deeply that we discover how strongly we love, right? Or when we are the most afraid that we discover our capacity for courage. So the reason I didn't put any chapters on them is because I wanted to take more of a trauma-informed approach to the development and really focus on cultivating the strongest and most holistic ground internally from which to engage with and process those difficult experiences. So they're woven throughout the book, but within the context of what are the antidotes that we need to cultivate in order to metabolize them. So I talk about those experiences within this broader context of cultivating a really strong, robust, and balanced heart that can handle and integrate the difficult experiences. The other thing, I think, the other reason I chose not to have individual chapters on them was there's a way in which kind of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts in the cultivation of attention and all the different qualities we develop. So take something like grieving, all of these different qualities come to play, like courage, compassion, and patience, to mention a few, to really allow our hearts to go through that process. Or with something like jealousy, the way generosity and gratitude can dissolve it. Or fear and anger, when we have access to wisdom and kindness and equanimity, those qualities create a container that can transmute the energies of fear and anger into clarity or into energy and power. So they're woven through and really held in the context of our goodness and our strength. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have a few more questions, but I think it's time to start to
Why
include
don't we
others.
do why don't we do one more?
Do one
Pick,
more
pick
from
and
me, you
see.
mean?
Yeah, from you, and then we can open things up.
Sure, whatever you want. Um, okay. You've recently become a new parent. Speaking about play and I don't know about rest, but I'm curious how that's affected your practice and if it's changed anything in the book in any way.
Well, I have much less time for formal practice. Um, so it has, yeah, forced me to really live the practice and to make the most of small moments of rest, of awareness, of connection. And while I miss having more downtime and free time for formal meditation, I also really love the challenge of making every moment practice in a very real way. It's been incredibly humbling. I think it's been really good for my personality to see, yeah, all the places I lose patience, or get grumpy or irritable when I haven't had enough sleep or haven't had enough time to, meditate or walk in the woods or something. So a lot of good dose of humility and just tremendous wonder and appreciation for the miracle of getting born, and for the immense amount of work parents everywhere do and have done. And then, yeah, in terms of the books, I wrote the first draft while my wife was pregnant, and then I edited the second draft, which was a very rigorous and challenging edit after our son was born, during the winter, and we weren't sleeping. It was a very challenging time. but I feel like his presence in our lives taught me a tremendous amount, and really just embodied so many of the qualities in powerful ways, that it provided a different kind of taste and insight into some of these, the innate nature of some of these qualities, as I was referring to before. And maybe the last thing is just, yeah, just this, one of the things that was the most startling, particularly in those early months of this, the utter vulnerability and helplessness that we arrive here with, and how it calls forth so much goodness and generosity. And even today, he's over a year old, and just being out in public with him, it's like his purity just calls forth the goodness in others. It's so beautiful to witness. And it's this remarkable affirmation of the beauty and goodness of our nature as human beings.
It's lovely. Okay, so I am not totally certain of how we're going to be receiving questions. I do have somebody wrote me one, which I will ask as a direct message in the chat, but I don't know what's our path here.
Yeah, so why don't we can open up the chat, and yeah, we want to take the rest of our time together, everyone, to hear from you, and how can we be of support with the themes we've been exploring? Do you have questions for either of us, or questions about the book or anything we've talked about? So you could drop a question in the chat, and you could also raise your hand, but you'll stay off camera just to honor privacy. So Sharon and I will stay spotlighted. Do you want to start with the question you got, Sharon?
Sure. Somebody was asking first about for you to speak toward the similarities in the name of your book and that of, is it Kyra? I can never know how to pronounce
Kyra
it. Kyra.
Duolingo, yeah.
Kyra Duolingo's book, which is called "We Were Made for These Times," and then something about the similarity in content. So I want to speak a little bit to that latter point because I've written 13 books at this point, and uh, there's only so much I understand, or and I hate to think I made any of this up anyway. I'm referring to either the Buddhist teaching or other sources or artists or therapists or somebody, and so I don't think there are that many topics actually. You either approach things from one angle or another, but it's the same kind of life, and we're all just trying to devote ourselves to one corner of it so that we can explore it. Okay, so what about that title?
Yeah. So Kyra and I are friends and colleagues, and well aware of the similarity of titles and also the terrain we're exploring in the books. So we talked about it actually before I settled on the title with the publisher. I think that the actual title, the first part, Shambhala recommended. And yeah, Kyra and I talked about it, and Kyra was very gracious in offering her blessing and basically said, I didn't come up with this title either. She took it from another person, from a letter from one activist, from a mentor to an activist. So I think that, as Sharon's pointing to, that some of the similarities are more about the relevance of our practice and the times that we're living in, and that these are the themes that are emerging in our times because it's what's needed. Yeah. And Kyra's book is wonderful, and they do overlap, but we also cover distinct things in both books. Are there folks? Are there?
Did you do an audio version?
I did. Yes, and it's available. It'll be released the same time as the book on November 21st.
And you're the one reading it? You're reading
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. It was really fun to read, actually. It was a way of, revisiting the whole book. It had been a few months since I'd looked at any of the text. That was enjoyable.
Well, I got another question for you. I believe it's for you. Please talk more about dealing with jealousy. The topic is hardly spoken about by teachers.
Yeah, thank you. Hmm.
It's interesting. There is a lot of stuff in the teachings about comparison, right?
Right.
And so often that comparison is leading not to sympathetic joy, but to the opposite, which would be
Yeah.
jealousy.
Yeah. I love that point, Sharon. A few different things come to mind for me. I'll share, and I wonder for you, Sharon, what comes to mind. So, I mean, one is just the stepping back and the acknowledgement of the suffering, right? Like I've heard you say, Sharon, like this is a state of suffering. Just that recognition that we're suffering is so important. Um, Understanding it as a contraction, there's a certain kind of craving and clinging in the heart, but not to demonize it, to see that contraction as a certain longing for something that we care about. So one way of working with jealousy, I think, is to try to connect with the aspect of our heart that either wants to feel fulfilled, wants to feel seen, recognized, beautiful, and to try to disentangle the reaching, the comparing, and the pain of that contraction with what it is that we want that could actually be meaningful or fulfilling, to disentangle those. That's one aspect of it for me. Another is to investigate and bring attention to the arising of clinging and contraction and the suffering inherent in that, so the heart learns how to let go. But of course, that takes resources. So I think jealousy needs to be counterbalanced and healed with dignity, self-worth, connection, uh, all of these things that nourish us. Gratitude is a huge, I think, antidote to jealousy, recognizing what we already appreciate and have as a way of reminding the heart of its fullness and remembering how to let go and experience that innate sense of well-being without reaching for something. So those are a few of the things that come to my mind. Anything you would want to add to that, Sharon?
Yeah, but I'm now reading another question.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
I think gratitude is a very interesting quality in the context in which you written this book and you're speaking, because in terms of social issues and needing to confront maybe oppressive systems or being treated unfairly, people often say, well, gratitude is like the stupidest quality because that's like being grateful for crumbs, instead of standing up and saying I deserve better. And so when I was doing research for one of my books, and I talked to scientists, and one of them said, no, it's actually quite different than that, according to the research, that if you practice gratitude, and it is a practice, you know, people do it in different ways, but they might say, at the end of the day, I'm going to write down 3 things I'm grateful for from the day. Or maybe you have a gratitude buddy and you text each other at the end of the day, like, hey, this thing happened. Um, if you practice gratitude, I've heard, research shows, then it's just what you're talking about. You get filled with a kind of energy. You don't feel depleted. You don't feel so impoverished internally. You don't feel so exhausted. And you have energy to try to make a difference, really.
Yeah.
And the other thing somebody said to me was, people who practice gratitude really want to pay it forward.
Mm,
They want to see other people get a break. They want to see them get some relief. They want to see them get better treatment. And then um, they have more energy to
yeah.
try to do that. So Another question: Do you? I love the idea of living these qualities you spoke of more consciously, reevaluating and being present to our values. Will you be offering any teachings on these qualities? So you can. What are you doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I have a bunch of events around the book happening. I think that the next one will be on the release date of the book, November 21st. So I'm just doing an open Q&A for an hour, just me. It's on my website. And then I'll be continuing to do events. So my website's the best place to see where that's happening. And the idea is that to also do some kind of online training in conjunction with the book at some point, perhaps not next year, but after that.
You talk about how humans evolved to be in communities of 50 to 150 and how some are overwhelmed with many more connections. But what about those who are lonely and isolated and alone? I know many for whom the loneliness and isolation that started in 2020 has continued, or people who are aging and lonely or disabled and lonely. Does your book talk about this?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate the question and just yeah, I think it's one of the challenges of our times is that even though we are surrounded by more and more virtual connections and people people are lonelier than ever. I talk about it in different ways. One whole part of the book, part 3, is devoted to exploring relationship and friendship and its role in these qualities. But I think there's several ways we can work with it. One is internally, and there's a difference between the experience of loneliness and solitude, right? Solitude is a sense of deep connection with oneself and the world, whereas loneliness is that absence of connection and the pain of that. And so how can we use internal resources to shift the experience and to develop more of that experience of richness inside? This is one avenue that shows up with different qualities in the book that I think is important because we're not in control of what happens externally, and we can't always make the new connections we want to. The other avenue is through the cultivation of different practices and qualities to find moments of connection, to see that while it takes time to build friendships and requires not only effort and energy and good luck and circumstances, we can find those moments of nourishment and connection in other ways, with a brief interaction, really taking in the natural world. I remember one time visiting with one of my first teachers, who was also one of Sharon's first teachers, though by many decades apart, Meninderji, and asking him if he was ever lonely because he lived such a different kind of lifestyle. And he said, no, I'm never alone because the birds are my friends and the trees are my friends and the sky and the clouds are my friends. And so I think we can begin to heal some of the loneliness if we know how to open our heart and allow ourselves to be nourished by the goodness that is around us in life, including the goodness in others who we just have passing connections with.
That's beautiful. I have one. Well, there are so many good questions. They're really coming in, but we don't have that much more time. How to develop patience with people, especially during conflicts, war, as well as personal?
Mm. Well, as the Buddha said, patience is the supreme virtue, right? Patience paves the road to freedom. I think first we need to understand what patience is. And I talk about this in the chapter on patience, and that patience is not gritting our teeth or, just hunkering down and bearing something. That often is a kind of aversion or resistance. That patience is actually a certain kind of softening or surrendering inside. And that there's a really important distinction between that softening and surrendering and being complicit with harm. And so patience is, I think, a very rich a nuanced quality that has both this aspect of a kind of widening and a softening inside that we can cultivate through meditation on a moment-to-moment level, as well as a certain strength that's about enduring. And we see that more on the external level of our lives, that we're able to find stamina, energy, resilience to stay engaged with something in spite of discomfort, activation, intense disagreement. And so really starting to understand the nature of patience, and then to be able to experience and cultivate its different facets, it becomes a resource for those kind of really difficult situations. Thanks for the great question.
Well, I think someone has to tell me if we need to stop, because
I think we
I
do. I
think we
think we should.
do.
Yeah, these are great questions, everyone. I want to encourage you, if you're free, to join me in a couple of weeks when the book actually comes out. I'll be doing, as I said, a 1-hour Q&A, just open. So that is on, it's on my website, and I'll just put the link here in the chat. But let's turn it over to you, Rob, to wrap us up and close for the evening.